First of all, here is a picture of one of the covers of the Revised Standard Edition. I'm very pleased to be able to finally see it in the physical flesh. I'm going to divide my presentation into a few sections of unequal length, starting with some preliminary comments. Before I began translating Freud's psychological works, I was engaged in a project to translate his neuroscientific works, and the drawing that you're seeing on the slide is drawn from a paper he published in 1878. This is a drawing of a nerve root emerging from the spinal cord, and in it, Freud observed that there are two different types of fibers. Some of them originate in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and others just follow those fibers and don't actually originate in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So Freud called the second type of fibers, he called them angelernte Fasern. Okay. If you translate that literally into English, it just means that the one type of fiber leans on top of the other type of fiber. When I translated this term in Freud's neuroscientific article, I translated it like this. Now, that's a preliminary comment that I will come back to. Now let us look at Strachey's translations of Freud's psychological writings. When I was appointed 30 years ago to revise the standard edition, the single biggest question I faced was, do I start again from scratch, or do I revise Strachey's existing translations? What I want to do in this part of my talk, which is the main part of my talk, is I want to tell you what decision I made on that question and why. Okay. In his preface to the first volume of the old standard edition, Strachey wrote the following statement that I have on the screen. Strachey said that as he was translating these writings, he imagined that they were the writings of some English man of science, of wide education, born in the middle of the 19th century. One part of this statement is not controversial. It is that he was imagining that these were the writings of an Englishman. That is, of course, the whole point of translation. You're translating from German into another language, in this case, English. So when Strachey said he's imagining Freud as an Englishman, he means that he's not taking the German and turning it into English word for word. He's trying to imagine this is written by an Englishman in good English. In doing that, you always lose something. Something is always lost in translation. One language doesn't map directly onto another. This is why I say no controversy attaches to this part of what Strachey said. The reason why I was asked to revise his translation, to revise the standard edition, is because many people had criticized the way Strachey translated Freud, but it was not because he translated him into English. It was about something else. What was controversial was that Strachey imagined Freud as an English man of science. According to Jean Laplanche, who was my equivalent in France, he translated Freud from German into French, and he said that this approach of Strachey's was a false scientization of Freud. I found it hard to understand why Laplanche said that, because here's what Freud himself said about psychoanalysis. In one of his very last papers, Freud said, "Psychoanalysis too is a natural science. What else can it be?" Freud's view of what he was doing, his own self-concept, was that he was doing science. He was trying to bring what he called psychical reality into science. How can you falsely scientize somebody who sees himself as a scientist? Well, let's have a look at why this complaint was made. Here are some examples of Freud's technical terms. In the first column, there are the German terms. I've just chosen some examples. In the first column, there's the German terms. In the second column, it's what those terms mean if you translate them literally. It's the English equivalent of the German. And in this column is the terms that Strachey used in his translation. Now, let's start with the first example. The German word Anlernung. It just means, any German speaker knows, it means leaning on. But Strachey translated it from ancient Greek as anaclysis. Here's the second example. This is another ordinary German word, Besetzung. It means occupation, like if an army occupies a town, or if you occupy the lavatory, then it's besetzt. Every German speaker knows what that word means, but Strachey didn't translate it as occupation. He translated it from ancient Greek as cathexis.
Okay.
Here is a third example.
Mm-hmm.
Freud used this technical term, Einfühlung, which every German reader knows, means feeling into. That's what it literally means. But Strachey didn't translate it as feeling into. He translated it from the ancient word empathy. So in all three of these examples, Freud used ordinary German. Here is another outstanding example. Das Ich, it just means the I. Everybody knows what that means. Every German knows Ich, it's me. But Strachey didn't translate it as it. He translated it as id, again from ancient Latin roots. And here is the last example, which again I've just chosen more or less randomly. The German word Schaulust, which every reader of German will know, that means desire to look or pleasure in looking. Strachey didn't translate it like that. Instead, he used, again, a neologism derived from Latin, scopophilia, which sounds like a horrible disease. So these are some typical examples of the controversy around Strachey's translation. It's not controversial that he translated Freud as if he were an Englishman. It's that he translated Freud using this scientific language. Rather than the ordinary terms that Freud used, he used these Greek and Latin terms. Now, when I was appointed to the task of revising the standard edition, I remind you, this was the big question I faced. Why did Strachey do this? Should I follow his technical terms, or should I provide us with new ones that are more like this? As I showed you in the first part of my talk, when I showed you that drawing of the nerve roots, Freud was a neuroanatomist. That's what he was first, for 20 years before he became a psychoanalyst. Here are some neuroanatomical terms. In German, there's a part of the brain which is called das Balken. In English, that would mean, in ordinary English, it means the beam. I'll show it to you. Here it is. It's a beam of fibers that connect the two hemispheres together. In German, it's called the beam. But in English anatomy, we call it the corpus callosum. The same applies to this term here, das Knie. It means the knee. I'll show it to you. Here it is. It's at the front of the corpus callosum. There is a bend which looks a bit like the human knee. That's why it's called das Knie. But I know it means a bridge. I will show it to you. Here it is. It's this bridge of fibers which connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. It's a bridge that circles around the brainstem like this. But in English anatomy, we don't call it the bridge. We call it the pons from Latin. There's another part of the brain called the Vierhögel, which means four hills. Here it is. 4 little bumps like that. You see 2 of them here, and there's 2 on the other side of the brain. They look like 4 little hills. So in German, they call them 4 hills. But in English anatomy, we use the Latin, corpora quadrigemina. Here is my favorite example. There's a part of the brain which in German anatomy we call the Kleinhirn. It means the little brain. Anybody who reads the word Kleinhirn know it means little brain. I'll show it to you. Here it is. Here's the little brain. Here's the big brain. So this little brain, in English, we don't call it the little brain. We call it the cerebellum. And that's compared to the Grosshirn, which in German, that's the technical term for it. It means big brain. But in English, we don't say big brain, we say cerebrum. So you can see the pattern. Just as over here, where Freud used ordinary German words, Strachey translated them with ancient Greek and Latin words rather than ordinary English words, because that is the convention in English scientific writing. In English scientific writing, whereas in German writing, you use ordinary words, the same as you use in ordinary language. In English scientific writing, you use words from Latin and Greek. So Strachey was just following the conventions of English scientific writing. In case you think I'm biased because I'm a neuroscientist, I want to give you examples from another science, chemistry. In German chemistry, there's a term Wasserstoff, which means water stuff. But in English chemistry, we don't call it water stuff, we call it hydrogen. The same applies here. In German chemistry, the technical term for this substance is Sauerstoff, which means nothing other than sour stuff. But in English chemistry, we don't call it sour stuff, we call it oxygen. If I was to translate Freud's ordinary psychoanalytic language like this, it would be as ridiculous as if I translated if Freud was a chemist, if I translated his language like this. If I spoke of the I and the it and occupation and leaning on, it would be like writing in chemistry about water stuff and sour stuff. Here is what Jones wrote. Jones said that in Germany, of all the civilized countries, it's the only one that eschews the international vocabulary, a fact that is called for much spleen among foreign readers of that language. In all countries, we use ancient Greek and Latin terms. It's a lingua franca in science. It's only in German that they don't do that. So all of these critics of Strachey, people like Laplanche and Bettelheim and many others, they're not recognizing this fact that in English scientific writing, you use Latin and Greek. Mm-hmm. What they also don't seem to realize is that Strachey didn't make these decisions by himself. There was a committee. Jones was the chair of that committee, and the committee made all these decisions together. What they also don't seem to realize is that Strachey spent time in Vienna in the 1920s, where he met with Freud every Sunday to discuss how he was translating his terms. After Strachey left Vienna and returned to London, he was regularly in correspondence with Freud, asking Freud's opinions and advice about the terms that he had chosen, the way he had selected to translate Freud. It's not surprising that Freud approved all of these translations of Strachey's because Freud saw himself as a scientist. So now we return to the term anaclysis that I began with. Laplanche says it's a barbaric and lifeless term. As I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, Freud used the term angelernte Fasern to describe a particular type of nerve fiber that he had discovered. If No English anatomist would call it a leaning on fiber. It sounds perfectly ridiculous. This sounds like ordinary English anatomy to describe it as anaclitic fibers. So when Freud in his psychological writings speaks about an angelernte typus of relationship, we don't call it a leaning on type of relationship, we call it an anaclitic type. If I had translated this term of Freud's, angelernte Fasern, as anaclitic fibers, but then I translated angelernte typus of relationship as a leaning on type of relationship, I would be disrupting the continuity in Freud's thought and language. So this was the basis upon which I made the decision that I'm not going to change Strachey's technical language. Here is the outstanding example that where Strachey made such an error. Freud uses two different German words in his writing. One of them is Trieb and another one is instinct, and Strachey translated them both as instinct. To me, that's an obvious mistake. They're two different German words and he uses one English word. So when you read that one word in English, you don't realize when Freud is saying Trieb and when Freud is saying instinct. Equally important is that the word Trieb and the word instinct don't mean the same thing. They denote very different things. A drive is a force that pushes, it's a demand for work. An instinct is a stereotyped action, which is a response to that demand. So this was the policy I followed. I only changed Strachey's technical vocabulary when he made mistakes, and here's the outstanding example. Sometimes it's not a matter of mistakes, it's a matter of controversy, it's a matter of the difficulty of mapping one language onto another. Here is a good example. Freud uses the word Seele a lot. In German, that means, literally translated, it means soul. But the soul in English is not the same thing as the mind. Seele also means mind. Seele can mean soul. Seele can also mean mind. So how do you deal with that problem? What I did was where Freud was clearly speaking about the immortal soul that lives on after you're dead, when he used the word Seele, then I translated it as soul. But where Freud was speaking about the thing that we use during life to do thinking and feeling and imagining with, then I translated it as mind. This word literally means afterwardness, but there is no such word in English. The word afterwardness does not exist in English, but that's what Nachträglichkeit means. So Strachey translated it as deferred action, and many of his critics were very angry about this. They said it completely distorts the meaning of the term. So these are different sorts of problems. It's not a matter of Latin and Greek and false scientization. It's a matter of how do you deal with these ambiguous words which don't have one obvious English equivalent. So what I did is where the right English word is different, like here it is subsequently, and here it is belatedly. These are two different English words. What I did is I put the German in square brackets afterwards, so the reader knows that when they see this English word, it's this German technical term. Where they see this English word, it's this German technical term. You will see that there's this little capital T that I put here. What that does is it tells the reader that in the 24th volume, there is a discussion of how this term can be translated. Here's another example with a different technical term, transference, the German of which is Übertragung. Sometimes the word is embedded in another word. Here, Erregung is the technical term, and that's the equivalent of the English neuronal excitation. So I make the reader aware in the margin that the technical term here that is discussed in the 24th volume is the term Erregung. And here with Abfuhr, it is Abfuhren. So here in volume 24, I have a long discussion of of how the technical terms should be translated. So here's the example of Abfuhren, which we just saw, and the example of Abwehr. Some of these discussions are brief and some of them are very long. In the case of important terms like Abwehr, what I've done is I tell the reader how Strachey translated this term, what the criticisms of that translation are, what the alternatives are that other people have suggested, how different people have translated this term in Freud and in other fields, because the word isn't only used in psychoanalysis. So the reader is informed of all the complex issues. So, for example, in the case of Abwehr, some critics of Strachey have suggested it should be translated suppression. Others have said warding off. Others have said fend off or fending off, fighting off, and so on. Rather than choosing one of these alternatives, I stuck with Strachey's term and made the reader aware of all of the controversy. Here's the same thing with some other words, motiv and Nachträglichkeit. Here are many of the different words that have been suggested for it. Now, this is to do with the technical terms, the major terms of psychoanalysis, but there are also some places where it's not a question of technical terms, but rather an individual sentence or phrase or title of a paper that's also been controversial. In these cases, I used a small t to let the reader know there's a controversy about how this sentence or phrase or word is translated. And then the reader can go to volume 24, to this list, and there they can find a discussion of how that phrase is translated. There are many notes like this for every volume. So again, I hope I'm making clear, my policy was, rather than try to find what is the correct translation, there's no correct translation. Rather, I made the reader aware of what the alternatives are. So far what I've showed you is how I revised the translation of Strachey, but I want to make you aware that the Revised Standard Edition does not only consist in revising Strachey's translations, it's also a matter of adding new translations. This new material, of which there are 56 papers, I translated them all from scratch, but I used the same technical language as Strachey used. So here, I'm just going to show you, here are some examples, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. These are new Freud works that were not in the old standard edition. 5, here's volume 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14. These are all all papers by Freud that were not included in the standard edition. Some of them are very important works, like this one, which is one of the missing metapsychological papers, the 12th metapsychological paper. Here again, these are all papers that were not in the original standard edition, but which I've included in the Revised Standard Edition, which I translated afresh. Here is an example of a particularly interesting paper. Freud, as you know, the Americans wanted only psychiatrists to practice psychoanalysis, and Freud didn't agree with that. Freud thought non-doctors should be able to practice psychoanalysis. So in 1927, Freud wrote a postscript to his book on this question of whether non-doctors should be allowed to practice psychoanalysis. Jones tells us in his biography of Freud that Freud said some nasty things about Americans there, and he advised Freud to cut them out, 3 sentences. If you actually go and look at the original manuscript, you see that it wasn't 3 sentences that Freud cut out, rather it was 6 paragraphs. And so I've translated those 6 paragraphs and put them in the Revised Standard Edition. It's actually very funny because it's a wild diatribe against everything American. It was really a terrible attack on everything American by Freud. Another particularly interesting part of the new material was the contributions that Freud made to a book about the American president, Woodrow Wilson. When this book came out in 1967, it was said to be a book by an American named Bullitt and Freud. But all of Freud's followers, including his daughter, said this book could not possibly have been written by her father. So what I've published in this revised standard edition is the original manuscript where Freud wrote in his own handwriting his contributions to the book on Woodrow Wilson. So Freud did contribute to this book. But what I showed is how Bullitt had distorted what Freud wrote. He changed it very, very badly. So I've reinstated what Freud actually wrote about Bullitt. Why this work is important is because Woodrow Wilson was a fundamentalist Christian, and here Freud wrote a critique of Christianity. Nowhere else does Freud give this really comprehensive discussion of the psychology of Christianity, so it's very important. So I will end there this introduction to the new Freud material that I included in the revised standard edition. But I want to mention in passing that there are 3 important works where Freud comments on homosexuality, which show that his views were much more enlightened than previously people thought. Now I want to speak about another topic, which is that I didn't only revise the translations and add new translations, I also updated the editorial apparatus because Freud's scholarship has progressed a great deal in the last 70 years, so it needs a lot of updating. So here I'm giving you some examples. The one thing is people using the old standard edition, and remember that a lot of the literature cites the old standard edition, so they wouldn't know where to find those quotations in the new standard edition, so I've put in the margins the old standard edition pagination. You will also see that I've underlined very lightly everything that is new, so the reader can see what is new in the new standard edition and differentiate it from what is old. As you can see, in some cases, there's a lot that's been added. This is an example from the Project for a Scientific Psychology. There's a lot of errors in the translation of this work and a lot that needs to be added to the editorial apparatus because Strachey was not a scientist. Ironically, Strachey, who is accused of falsely scientizing Freud, he made many errors because he was not a scientist and he didn't understand some scientific things. I also have provided cross-references to the neuroscientific works. Although they're not yet out, they are sufficiently far advanced that I was able to provide cross-references to them. Now, as part of the updated editorial apparatus, I had to update Freud's bibliography. This is the official listing of all Freud's publications. And they are listed in chronological order, and each one is given a date, and then there's a letter that goes with that date, like 1900A, 1900B. This is the official identifying marks for each one of Freud's works. It's in the Freud bibliography. Now, you might ask, why would Freud's bibliography need updating? He's not publishing anything anymore, he's dead. But this is not correct. First of all, as I showed you, Strachey left out some of Freud's psychological writings, and now they need to be inserted into his bibliography. This includes Freud's neuroscientific writings. Strachey left out most of Freud's neuroscientific writings. He didn't even know they existed. Then, of course, there's also the fact that many of Freud's unpublished writings, especially his correspondences, have been published after his death over the last 50 years. This is how we come to these astonishing facts. The standard edition listed 368 entries, of which 310 were published during Freud's lifetime. The revised standard edition lists 1,736 entries. Compare these numbers, of which 687 were published during Freud's lifetime. So Strachey overlooked more than 350 of Freud's publications published during his lifetime. I think, again, it really is ironic that the Strachey who is accused of falsely scientizing Freud actually was not even aware of most of Freud's scientific publications. Now, I'm at the end of my talk, so I just want to say a few other things. One of the questions that I faced was, how should I translate some words that Freud uses which are offensive? For example, Freud speaks about primitive tribes and about savages. These are terms which nowadays people recognize are racist and offensive. So, for example, Freud says that the people of Africa are primitive and the people of Australia are savages. There is, of course, a temptation to sanitize this language, but I don't think that's the job of the translator. The translator must accurately convey what the writer says, and so I have retained the offensive terminology. Another difficult editorial decision. I've already said to you that I had to update the editorial apparatus to bring it up to date with modern Freud scholarship, because there's been an enormous amount of research on Freud and, for example, on his patients in the last 70 years. So, in the research that's been done about Freud's patients, their names have been revealed. We now know the real names of the Rat Man, Little Hans, the Wolf Man, Dora, and so on. So I faced the dilemma, since all of these names are now in the public domain, should I include them in the updated editorial apparatus? What I decided to do was to include all the information that's necessary to show how Freud had distorted the material so that we can understand more fully the lives of these patients, but I did not include their names. I think that this is a very important ethical principle, and in the official translation of Freud's works, we should not violate that principle. I thought to myself, imagine if I was going into analysis as a patient. Would I want to worry? Maybe one day my analyst will be so famous that my name will be revealed in my case history. My thinking is that if that risk exists, psychoanalysis becomes impossible. Now, as I said, I'm coming to the end. I'm just telling you about a few little things before I stop. One of them is that as much as I admire the old standard edition, I think its illustrations were very poor. So I've included new illustrations, and I just want to show you two little examples for fun. Here's one of them. Freud was writing this letter to his fiancée, and while he did it, he made this ink blot. What Freud was writing at the time that he made this blotch of ink was he was very jealous about her, and he was worried that she was with another man. So Freud drew a circle around those ink blots, and then he wrote in here, I think that maybe this is because I'm feeling so hit up. He says, maybe there's some secret meaning in the ink blot. This was in the middle of the 1880s. So this was the first time that Freud made an interpretation of a parapraxis, of a slip. Here's another example of a new illustration in the Revised Standard Edition. Freud wrote many, many letters to Fliess. It was a very important correspondence to his friend Fliess. It's one of the envelopes of those letters that Freud sent to Fliess. What I found so humorous about this is the address. Basically, it says little more than to Dr. Fliess in Berlin. I don't know how it got to him. I will end by saying that also I have provided new indexes. Each volume has a new index, and there's one cumulative index in volume 24. The old indexes were very poor, so now we have much better indexes. This sort of work, indexing, it's extremely boring. People who haven't done this sort of work can't imagine how years go into even just that. So that's the work of this kind of edition that is behind the scenes. So I have come to the end of my presentation. This is what Strachey wrote in his dedication of the old standard edition. He said, "It's to the thoughts and words of Sigmund Freud. This, their blurred reflection, is dedicated by its contriver." And here is the dedication that I put in the revised standard edition. I said, "And to the noble contrivances of James Strachey, this still imperfect reflection is dedicated by his successor." Thank you very much.